It is my pleasure now to invite to the stage to welcome us to country the celebrated Ngambri custodian Paul House. Paul's family and personal ties to this place are strong and deep, and we're honoured that he's here to welcome us this morning. Paul.
Gawuri, thank you. Baladu Yaba, Ngambri-Ngunnawal, Nyang. I'm speaking Ngambri-Ngunnawal language. Mijambalda Paul House Girua. My name is Paul House Girua. Yilingalangbo, Gibabanga Wogabo Migabo, Didder Nilbang Mayin. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Nyari Njamali, Ngambri, Wogalu, Wallabalawa, Ngunnawal, Wujigang, Yanangbu, Jayandu. My respects to Ngambri, Wogalu, Wallabalawa, Ngunnawal, elders past and present. Ngambri-Ngunnawal Mayin, Gaimbanya, Ninyoga, Nurumbangu, Dara. Ngambri-Ngunnawal people welcome you all to country. And I would like to acknowledge the ancestors for laying such a strong foundation, the matriarchs, the patriarchs for laying such a strong foundation for the younger generation to move forward. My name is Paul House. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country, like a few of us here today at Old Canberra Hospital. And when our ancestors first met Europeans on the horizon in the 1820s, early 1800s, they were asked by our European ancestors, what do you call this place? And our ancestors didn't respond by saying the barbecue area. The different renditions of the word Ngambri and Canberra came back. And a little bit further to the north of Canberra, our ancestors were also asked, where are we, by Europeans? And our ancestors simply responded by saying Ngunnawal. In language, Ngunnawal means here. So I also like to acknowledge my other multiple Aboriginal ancestries from the southeast here, including the Parjong Gundungra as well, and the Wiradjuri speaking Marama Arambi people. And our welcome to country is made in the spirit of peace and a desire for harmony for all peoples of the modern ACT and surrounds. And our main aim is to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre and post contact of this region. And as local custodians, we now warmly welcome everyone now living and working on our ancestral lands. Our people who, through law and custom, continue to hold our traditional cultural connections in a contemporary society. Evidence of our occupation can be seen right throughout the country here in the region. Our signature is not just in the land, it's in our DNA. Looking after land and country is very important to us. So the more we look after the land and the rivers, the more it looks after us. And when our ancestors, little quick story, when our ancestors first saw sheep here in the region, the only way they could describe what they saw was a word called jumbak. And that word jumbak got Romanised into jumbak. And in language, jumbak means small clouds of smoke. And we have lots of amazing stories around language and how these stories connect us to country. So our people through common law in pre-contact times held strong portfolios of democracy here on our land for over 65,000 years. Portfolios of binding economics, religion, judicial systems, educational systems for our people, and powerful and compelling connection to country. And we must remember that under the concrete and the steel of our cities and towns is a rich Indigenous history, a 65,000-year-old history, which is now a shared history that belongs to all of us. And we all have a responsibility in looking after country, Nurumbangu or Dara, we call land and country. We have great responsibility to lead our children. And we want to see our children grow up in a society that honours, respects and acknowledges the Indigenous people of our great country. We also believe we're entitled to a greater share in the wealth and prosperity of our land as well. So we work hard to educate the politicians and the bureaucracy here in Canberra, and we sing a song and a phrase called Buthangariyala. Buthangariyala means speak the truth. And we're constantly sending that message to Parliament House. and working hard with everyone on country and around the country. So in conclusion, I'd like to say the law of the land talks about giving respect and honour to all people in all parts of the country. Being gentle, polite, empower each other, hold fast to each other. As I said, look after the land and the rivers. It's all connected, not just environmentally but also spiritually on our land and country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, and on behalf of my mother as well, Matilda, my mother, Dr. Auntie Matilda House, and our matriarchs and our patriarchs, I say Gurabari, welcome, and Wurrugawuri, thank you, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. That was a moving and fitting welcome and start to our day. Now, I know you have other important work to get on to today, so thank you for making time to join us this morning. And thank you to all of those people whose traditional lands we're meeting on today for welcoming us here with Paul's welcome. As we share our own knowledge and research practices, I'd like us all to take a moment to reflect on and remember the knowledge forever embedded in custodianship of land, and which continues to shape and inform our approaches to the world and to each other. Some meetings and events like this one are opened with a welcome from an Aboriginal person with deep ties to country. Many are opened with a simple acknowledgement of Aboriginal custodianship of land and by paying our respects. I often think about acknowledgement of country and what it is we're really saying and doing when we perform this ritual. A colleague commented to me recently that acknowledgement of country is in danger of becoming a bit like saying grace before a meal, something that we do because we're in the habit of doing or we feel obliged to. I don't feel that way about it. There is power in ritual and in collective memory and in acknowledgement. To me, regardless of whether or not we have Indigenous blood, acknowledging country is drawing a thread through history because we all, each and every one of us, comes with a personal history, and each of us is also embedded inextricably in the history of the people of our land and that of our evolving society. Of course, we are all also citizens of the planet. We're individuals and we're also part of a whole that is both spatial and temporal. My story and your story cannot exist without the context of history. In acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, we're paying respect to country, also to people, and importantly to the part that their stories have played in the stories of each and every one of us. So it's particularly fitting to open a symposium like today's in this way. I'm honoured to be invited to chair the first half of today's meeting, and I've been given the chance to say a few words before the experts take to the stage. As the chair of the Australian National Commission for UNESCO, I'm here today representing my fellow commissioners, all of whom bring deep expertise and passion in each of the key strategic areas for UNESCO: natural sciences, communications and information, education, culture, and human and social sciences. Our seventh commissioner represents the voice of youth. UNESCO, as you may know, was established by education ministers in the 1940s, very soon after the end of World War II. The founders were so horrified by the ravages of war that they vowed to create a multinational agency dedicated to building peace through education. This mission remains at the core of UNESCO today. The freedom to pursue knowledge and the importance of being able to freely share that knowledge both speak to the mission of peace. The preservation and celebration of the multitude of cultures that thrive around the world strives to deepen understanding of difference and build connection between people from different backgrounds and with different practices, beliefs, and artistic expression. The celebration and preservation of natural heritage likewise serves to build and deepen our ties to country. The paramount importance of opening pathways to education for the most underserved in our global community, girls and those living in unrest and in poverty, building peace in the hearts of women and men. Australia was a founding member state of UNESCO. The Australian government's current priorities as a member of UNESCO are to contribute to the World Heritage Program through membership on the World Heritage Committee and through custodianship of our many World Heritage properties, to celebrate the International Year of Indigenous Languages next year, and it's a particularly poignant international year for this ancient land. And as Paul mentioned, language is more than just language. Language is also history and culture and family ties and ties to land. to continue to work towards a global convention recognising tertiary qualifications internationally, to protect the freedom of journalists to do their necessary work, their vital work in safety, and to support greater representation in UNESCO for our Pacific Island neighbours, whose voices are too often overwhelmed by more populous nation-states. The national commissions exist in every nation which is a member of UNESCO. It's our job to represent the community in advising government as a member of UNESCO. It's also our job to foster and raise awareness of UNESCO's work in our country. In both these roles, it's a pleasure to be with you all today, to hear and contribute to conversations about our history and our future history, and how to ensure that it is preserved and shared to inform and shape us and our children and the generations that follow them. The Australian National Commission's key aims are to improve connections between UNESCO programs and networks within Australia, to raise public awareness of UNESCO's mission and access to the work that's being done towards it, here and in our region, to support growing cultural preservation and outreach in the Asia-Pacific, and to support greater understanding of and respect for Australia's Indigenous cultural heritage, languages and knowledge. We're also working with the UNESCO chairs to support press freedom around the world, and importantly for today, we're strengthening our ties with the National Archives of Australia, which is working hard towards international measures to protect digital documentary heritage. The Archives are generously hosting our National Commission meeting next week, and thank you, David and colleagues. And I'm keen today to learn how we can better support important work here and around the world to preserve digital documentary heritage for future generations. This symposium is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to explore the scientific, technical and logistical challenges and opportunities in the preservation of digital heritage, but also the cultural and historical context that informs that preservation. Like history itself, preserving our digital heritage is important on both a personal level and a societal level. Among many thousands of records held in the National Archives are fragments of the history of my own family, documents that tell me something of my grandfather's, my grandmother's and my mother's journey here after World War II, when, at about the same time that UNESCO was established, they joined many of their German compatriots in fleeing war-torn Europe to make a fresh start down under. The letters Orpah and Ormar wrote each other during the 3 years that passed between his passage to Australia and hers form another part of that puzzle, insights into the personal and political that remain as emotionally fresh and relevant today as the years in which they were written. These papers provide a glimpse of a moment in time that shaped the world that we live in today, not just for my family, but for all of Australia, whose national identity is inextricably bound up in the stories of these post-war immigrants. By contrast, the love letters exchanged in my own modern-day marriage are, for the most part, emails, text messages, WhatsApp chats, discussions on Facebook Messenger, and on the online forum where my wife and I first met. They're pixels on an electronic page. How would future historians treat this random collection of ones and zeros? Where are the archives that will hold this disparate bunch of data? With recording devices in every pocket and the World Wide Web at our fingertips almost all of the time, we're lulled into a false sense of security. We've brought into the fiction that all of the information we could possibly want to access is there, all of the time, and for all time. But the truth is that the access of future generations to our recent history is more precarious than ever. Digital heritage is incredibly fragile. The pace of technological innovation is quickening, and with every innovation, another technology tips towards obsolescence. The floppy disks that lurk unusable in the bottom drawer of your home desk. The basic websites created in the 90s for green screen computers and dial-up modems. As the pace of change accelerates and the volume of information grows, the need for coordinated action to preserve our digital history is becoming increasingly urgent. Governments, industry, academics, and memory institutions must work together to develop the necessary information, the governance, the digital preservation standards, and the stable storage solutions that will enable digital documentary heritage to exist for future generations. So we're here today to discuss how this can be achieved, the steps that we need to take to preserve this history. We're here to explore the implications of preserving our digital heritage, the implications for our future culture, our future self-knowledge, and our future identity. the implications for their future capacity to educate and to build peace in the minds and the hearts of women and men. I trust today's meeting will be collegiate, fruitful and robust, and that we'll each leave richer with knowledge and energised towards the mission of protecting our own history for the generations that will come after us. To set the scene, it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. As Director General of the National Archives of Australia, David Fricker has worked tirelessly towards a whole-of-government approach in continuity in managing and recording digital information, as well as towards making that information more accessible to the public. He's working towards these aims in Australia and internationally as President of the International Council on Archives and Vice Chair of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee. He's also our host today, so please join me in welcoming David Fricker.
Thank you very much, Kylie, first of all for those words and that introduction. And may I just recommit the National Archives of Australia to doing all we can to support the mission of UNESCO, which we regard as being a shared mission of the National Archives. And thank you so much for making the time to be here today and giving this event so much momentum. May I also thank Paul Howes for his very generous welcome to country. May I also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people upon whose traditional lands Canberra is built, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us here today. Just a little pick up on a few of those themes that Kylie just put us through, because you really did touch, in fact I don't need to speak, I think you covered it all. Touched on the essence of what we're here to talk about today, is that our digital heritage doesn't exist yet for the most part. What we're doing is thinking about what we're doing for future generations. Our people we serve haven't been born yet. And you did mention those words, obsolescence, and the very fragile nature of digital heritage, and yet the way that we are as a society so complacent about it. Kylie also mentioned I'm the President of the International Council on Archives, and I just thought for a moment I might just introduce, perhaps for those who don't know what the ICA is, why it exists and what its mission is, and why the ICA has a particular interest in the topic that we're talking about today. The ICA is a non-government organisation, as it says up there, 1,400 members, around 190 countries. There's about 140 national archives, institutional members, professional associations of members and individual members as well. It is the only international association for archives, and it is certainly the peak international group, advising UNESCO as well as the professional community on matters concerning archives. Its vision is to have a regime, an international system where the key decision makers, the policy makers, the legislatures are really taking into account the importance of our archival heritage. Specifically that part of our documentary heritage. For two reasons, and highlighted in red there, there's sort of two sections there. Good governance, the rule of law and administrative transparency. That is that our governments are not going to function. Our civil society won't function unless we have a proper respect for authentic, available and enduring records that are created, primary source material. In a world where the truth is not the truth anymore, in the world where we are constantly being asked to assess what is fake news, what is real news, where we have to rewrite history almost every day of the week, what we need are primary sources. People cannot form their own opinions, people cannot find their own truth unless they have access to primary source material. And that therefore drives good governance across society, rule of law and administrative transparency. Of course, we're also dealing with the issue of trust. This is something where every conference now, we're talking about trust in public institutions. When I was a boy, you'd trust the banks, you'd trust the church, you'd trust your government, You'd trust the newspapers, but none of those things now are taken for granted. So those institutions, the societal institutions that we used to rely on to trust, are no longer as rock solid as they used to be. The second things there, though, are also the preservation of mankind's, it's a bit old-fashioned for the ICA, humankind's collective memory and access, because everyone's personal agency now in an information society is really driven by the extent to which we can access information. Because if we are not permitted to access information, either deliberately or through more insidious means, then we are not going to have full agency in life, and we're going to be denied the opportunities that we should have. And so those two things about the way civil society is run, the way governments are run, and the way that our society and our cultural prosperity is allowed to flourish depends on our access to authentic, accessible and reusable primary source material. It's also important, if I can get this clicker, oh, here we go, sorry. Hang on, let me go back a bit. And it's also important to think, okay, well, where are these records? So as Kylie has just said, once upon a time we would write letters, we'd put a stamp on the front of the envelope, we'd mail it, we'd have photographs in photo albums, we'd have shoe boxes full of letters and postcards and memorabilia. But these days, of course, our society is being documented on digital platforms. And so all of the information that documents the way that we are living our lives at the moment, the decisions that we're taking, the information that's put in front of us as a society, the advice that we're given by government and those other institutions of society are being done on digital platforms. And not only that, but they're not actually government-owned platforms. They're not sort of major corporate platforms necessarily, and they're not necessarily within the Australian or any particular national sovereign jurisdiction either. So it really is in the cloud, as we like to say, and the reason we use the cloud, of course, as a metaphor is because we don't think about it anymore. It just goes up there somewhere, sort of hovers around in somewhere. We don't think about the infrastructure it runs on, we don't think about who owns it, who has legal rights over it. All of these things are getting more and more lost. And as a result of all of that, over time, we're finding that whereas once at the beginning of our digital society, most of our digital lives were recorded on mainframes by that highly fashionable people that used to operate those mainframe computers. I shouldn't laugh, actually, that could be me back in the 70s. So it was once, yes, it was digital, and we didn't quite understand it, but we could kind of point to a roll of mag tape, and we sort of knew the big room where the mainframe was. But then as, IT develops, the memory devices become more consumable, we get more sort of personal computers in the homes, and so our memory is then committed off those major mainframes that we know exist and have fire, fire retardants, etc., and they get put onto floppy disks, they get on CDs, they get on mag tape, memory cards, etc. And so already they're becoming a bit more sort of loose, unregulated, unmanaged. And now, of course, we are just pushing stuff into the cloud. Any sort of removable media seems quite old-fashioned these days. And so as a result of that, our collective memory is becoming more ephemeral. And ephemeral meaning that you just keep it for a little while until it's not needed anymore for your particular business or your transaction, and after that you get rid of it. But this is a great shame because, as I say, who's documenting our Australian society? And if our Australian society is being documented largely in digital form and it's being made more and more ephemeral, well then we have a big risk. We are at risk from technological obsolescence as well as neglect and just complacency amongst society. So it is an issue. It's also important at a global scale because the United Nations in 2015 updated their Millennium Goals to come up with our Sustainable Development Goals. So these are goals that we have set for ourselves to achieve by 2030, which the United Nations has determined through a large program of consultation that we need to achieve if we're going to attain a peaceful, just and inclusive society, and we're going to have equal access to justice and respect for human rights. And it of course, depends on these aspects of maintaining memory for good governance, for transparent, effective and accountable institutions, but also to maintain that collective memory. And there's a few up there that I'll just zoom in on. One is the goal 4 around quality education, which is acknowledged requires inclusive and equitable education and lifelong learning opportunities for all. It means people need to have access to information. They need to be able to reach into society's memory and make up their own minds about what happened and find their own truth. Similarly, goal 16, around justice and strong institutions. And in there, we need to have accountable, transparent institutions at all levels. Again, you need to find the evidence to be able to establish transparency and integrity. People's, birth, registration. I mean, just simple facts about information around people's birth, around who they are, what their identity is, and also ensuring public access to information. And these things require some management. These things will not happen by accident. Finally, goal 17 also talks about partnerships to achieve the goals. And that really means that all of us in a community, memory institutions and others, need to be working together to make sure that policymakers, all levels of government and other areas of policy, even in the corporate sector, have got access to reliable data. Because what we're seeing is if we leave the collection of digital memory to happenstance, to chance, well then we are going to end up with a memory of a society of white-skinned, English-speaking middle class, because that's where most of the data is created. That's where Amazon, is going to start harvesting most of its information, Google, etc. But what about the others? What about the non-English speaking? What about the people in less resource societies? How are they going to be remembered? So we can't leave this stuff to chance, is the message there. Then UNESCO. If I just touch on the role of UNESCO, and in particular the UNESCO Memory of the World program. Back in 2012, UNESCO, through its Memory of the World program, recognised the urgency of this issue. I have to keep checking the time. Maybe, Sean, I might ask you to give me a bit of a warning when I've got 5 minutes to go. So I can talk all day about this. I have a captive audience, so I might just... can't resist the temptation. So back in 2012, UNESCO convened in Vancouver a conference on documentary heritage. Now, out of that, in particular, came the beginnings of what is now the UNESCO recommendation concerning the preservation of documentary heritage and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form. And out of those resolutions, or out of the Vancouver Declaration, were a number of resolutions, and one of which was to promote more dialogue between memory institutions, between civil society, between the IT industry. One was to establish some sort of international framework around the selection and preservation of digital documentary heritage. In particular, it handed that responsibility to the Memory of the World. The other poster up there, the Universal Declaration on Archives, was back in 2011, which was another instrument that UNESCO introduced just prior to 2012, which recognised the importance of archives as an underpinning of just and inclusive societies. So recognise the importance of archives as the memory of humankind and as the resource that enables and nourishes the development of prosperous and civilised societies. So these are very important UNESCO instruments which have come forward, which are now allowing us to unite a whole range of activities around this issue of digital heritage. Out of that Memory of the World program, I should just comment on the Memory of the World program. So Memory of the World program, we're all very familiar with the World Heritage program in UNESCO, with intangible heritage. These are conventions. There are many other conventions as well. The Memory of the World program within UNESCO is that program focused on documentary heritage. So it places documentary heritage alongside World Heritage sites and intangible heritage. And it talks about documents in all forms, preserved largely in libraries and archives, but documentary heritage in all its forms. It has regional committees set up across the world with 54 national committees, and there's a very active Australian committee as well of Memory of the World, and I just acknowledge Michael Piggott up the back there, who's a member of our Australian Memory of the World committee. It does have a register of every 2 years. It announces particularly important fond or particularly important documents for registration by UNESCO as documentary heritage of outstanding international significance. That does attract quite a bit of attention. It's quite a good mechanism. However, Memory of the World is much, much more than just the register. Because it created this PERSIST program. So PERSIST is that program within the Memory of the World that says, okay, we are going to implement those resolutions out of the Vancouver Declaration and do something globally about digital documentary heritage. And so the mission there is that we need to establish policies, strategies and practices for the preservation and sustained use. And the vision there is that the world's digital heritage is accessible to future generations. And really, in a practical sense, it means that we're going to protect documentary heritage against neglect and technological obsolescence, and we're going to ensure that at the very least memory institutions are able to interact with documentary heritage that would otherwise be inaccessible through obsolescence. So that's really the mission of PERSIST, and it really is, to my way of thinking, a lot of what we're doing today. Now, there is an awful lot going on around the world already, and those logos that I've scattered around the slide there indicate just some of the activity going on. You know, and there's just a few: the Software Heritage Foundation, the Digital Preservation Coalition, which our speaker Tim Gollins has been heavily involved with here, the National Archives through its Xena open source stuff, etc., etc. So there's a lot going on. The IPRES conferences is also a thing. So we're not trying to duplicate the global effort. Neither is it a competitive exercise. What the PERSIST is trying to do to add value is to provide through the UNESCO, the convening power of UNESCO, some way to coordinate that, to bring it all together and bring in a multiplier effect to it. So providers and enablers can have some sort of strategic direction for the research and development community. So universities, research areas, institutions who are undertaking research and who are wondering where the highest priorities are for ongoing research would be able to get a steer through UNESCO PERSIST. Endorsement support for fundraising, to become affiliated, to get a letter of support or to obtain funding for a particular initiative can be greatly assisted by association with UNESCO PERSIST. So, for example, to seek ARC funding. For practitioners, you know, for memory institutions like the National Archives, to be able to reach out and find best practice guidelines, the current international best thinking on something or the major challenges, to understand what are the ethical problems, what are the technological challenges, etc. These things are all strengthened, and the activities of all of those other communities are strengthened by having the convening power of UNESCO. So this is what PERSIST is doing. Now, I'm clicking, there we go. So just a few things, because I think I am slowly running out of time, or quickly running out of time. So as I said, PERSIST is going to do a few things. It's going to promote dialogue. Now, we have quite a bit of dialogue between archives amongst ourselves through ICA and other organisations. There's a lot of dialogue between libraries through IFLA and other associations, ALIA in Australia. And so what we do need to do is extend that out amongst all the memory institutions to promote more structured, more effective, more productive dialogue. But it's also got to include dialogue with industry as well. And I'm so delighted that we have Ryan here today from Dell. We're going to hear from the IT industry, because this is one of those areas that we are underdone at the moment. We have to start reaching out across the various sectors to find out, well, what's the future of IT? What's the future of technology? And what technology is being designed now for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in the future? And how are we shaping and influencing that to make sure it will meet our requirements? And I am delighted that Dell is here on board to talk with us today. So it's about promoting that dialogue. It's also about selection, because if we wait until a memory institution has decided to grab some material, because 10 years ago we thought the Twitter conversation around Donald Trump was, historically significant. Well, it'll be too late, because Twitter will be out of business by then. It would have been sold on, it'll be merged with something else, and that data will no longer exist. And if that data exists, it won't be reliable or it'll be inaccessible. So today, we need to be thinking about what are we doing about selecting culturally significant material today to rescue it before it becomes inaccessible, lost or obsolete. So selection is very important, and Persist has produced the guidelines for selection of digital heritage. And again, that was an ICA-IFLA collaboration. It was launched a couple of years ago now, and we should look forward to another edition coming up. It's been translated into about 6 languages as well. So that's also an important part of what we're doing. And then finally, it's around policy setting, so that governments, memory institutions, industry, thanks Sean, and various others are starting to establish policies around, well, how do you recognise culturally significant digital material? What sort of policies should you have for your appraisal, for your acquisition policies, your retention policies, and your digital preservation strategies? So this is around those. The other thing I'd mention is the recommendation concerning the preservation of documentary heritage. Under that recommendation for UNESCO, every member state will be reporting back to UNESCO every 4 years on what progress that we are each making as member states towards the achievement of that UNESCO recommendation. And so this policy setting will also enable us as a global community to sort of join up that reporting, to sort of see what we're doing as a global community about the selection, preservation and ongoing access of our documentary heritage. There we go, twice. And the final thing I'll mention here as well is that we are also, not only are we thinking about documents as documentary heritage, but software is also a part of our digital heritage. And this is also underdone, I think, because we do in archives and in libraries, not exclusively, we do sometimes think about software, but not enough, I think, is it up there on the list as being part of our digital heritage. So it has heritage value as executable code, and here we might be talking about interactive documentary heritage, and might be talking about games, video games, which reflect our society and the development of our society, but also heritage software that enables us to interact with heritage content in an authentic way. So we need to be preserving software, executable material, as part of our digital heritage as well. And so a part of what Persist is doing is looking at a way that we can work through issues around rights management, copyright, legal issues, to make sure that we have some sort of a platform upon which we can reperform digital material in an authentic manner, preserving the integrity of the software that was used to create it and the software that was used to render it the way that the author had intended. It's a big challenge. It combines, I think, some preservation of ecosystems to run old software, but also emulation techniques, etc. So this is another part of what we want to do, so that we can go back and relive those Wang green screens from the 1970s that we all miss so dearly, because that was culturally very, very significant. Finally, I'd encourage to find out more and to get involved in this, because as I say, this whole Persist is about enlivening a community of collaboration to make sure that we are joining with active programs, initiatives which are underway, as also as harnessing that knowledge and sharing it with the global community. And not surprisingly, there is a website. And the website is there, unescopersist.org, which I would invite you to visit and have a look. There are guidelines in terms of community engagement guidelines. So if you have an initiative that you would like to get some support for, you would like the endorsement of UNESCO for some research that you're doing, universities or others looking for ARC funding who would like a letter of support to highlight the importance and the significance of what they're doing. Perhaps you'd like to reach out and see if there are some best practice guidelines available for a particular problem that you're facing, or you've developed some best practice policies or guidelines and you would like to contribute that. Perhaps you've got something which you think should be translated into other languages to have a wider audience around the world. These are all things that we're trying to get going through this UNESCO Persist program, and it all starts there on that unescopersist.org website. So I would encourage you to get on board with that. We have some involvement underway already. We have some traction getting away. As I've mentioned, the selection guidelines have been published, where there's a number of events like this which are now being conducted around the world. In Australia, we have with Flinders University, we are partnering with those, with Flinders, on digital media archives for ARC funding. Internationally, and I mentioned the Digital Preservation Coalition because Tim is here, but also we've partnered with DPC, who are preparing a set of guidelines on digital preservation, so a sort of a toolkit for those undertaking digital preservation tasks. So there is stuff which is already underway, which is already getting going, and I really would encourage each of you in your professional capacities and in your other capacities to really think about if you have some role to play in the long-term preservation of our digital documentary heritage. There is a home for that, and that is the UNESCO Persist. So please visit that website, give it some thought, and get involved. And with that, I will say thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, for setting the scene and giving us the big picture so admirably. We are going now from the big picture right down to the very personal, into the core of some of the nutty issues. So one of the key concerns of individuals regarding preservation of great volumes of data is one of privacy. In an era when we're potentially watched 24 hours a day, when we voluntarily collect and share our own medical information via devices worn on our wrists or around our necks, where our phones are computers and collect information about our shopping habits, our transport preferences, and what, where, and when we eat, how do we decide what to preserve, let alone how to preserve it? To answer the big questions, no pressure at all, of course, we're joined by an expert in digital preservation. Professor Tim Gollins is Head of Preservation and Information Management at the National Records of Scotland, and he leads their digital preservation program. He's worked for decades on information security, retrieval and management, and he's designed numerous large government information projects. So he's joining us this morning to speak on the topic of sensitivity, a fundamental challenge to preservation. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much. And first of all, before I do anything else, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and I wish to acknowledge and respect their continued culture and their contribution they make to the life of this city, this region, and this nation. I also wish to repay my respects to their elders, past and present. It's my pleasure, I can tell you, absolute pleasure, to be a visitor in this place. I'd like to thank the UNESCO Persist project, David Fricker, National Archives of Australia, and a number of and numerous other organisations that have made my trip here possible. I've been enjoying myself here in Australia now for a little bit more than a week, and and I'm absolutely fascinated by this country and the challenges that we all face in preserving our digital heritage. The clicker isn't working. Try the clicker again, Gollins. No, that didn't work either. Try again. Ah, there we go. Technology, it's good, isn't it? Right. So I've got to start things off on my computer here because I've got a load of notes that's going to remind me what to say and give me half a chance of hitting the timeline that I have to hit today. So let's get the timer up as well, because otherwise I'm going to completely lose it. Right. There we go. Right. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about various things, but first of all I'm going to start off with some assumptions. I'm quite new to the world of UNESCO Persist. I haven't needed to bump into it, I think is probably the appropriate phrase to use in my practice in Scotland. That is a dereliction on my part, and bears no reflection on UNESCO Persist and the importance of its work. But having to give this keynote today, I've had to do a little bit of reading up on the matter. So I thought it would be helpful, before I started, just to set out some assumptions. So I asked myself, well, what's this digital documentary heritage stuff? Because I work in an archive, and I kind of know what we do. So what's this digital documentary heritage? And is it different from what we do in an archive? And the answer is, for me, it's extraordinarily broad concept. And that's important to remember. It isn't simply the Declaration of Arbroath, a document that we hold at the National Records of Scotland that talks about effectively the founding of the Scottish nation. It's tweets, it's Facebook pages, and all the things that we've already heard mentioned. And then we need to think about what do we mean by digital preservation, and what properties does it have? One of the things it has is it's very expensive when we talk about doing it at scale. But an important thing to remember about digital preservation is it's economically driven. And that comes back to this idea of selection that David mentioned. What do we select to keep? And that selection, broadly speaking, has to be drawn on utility and value, by whatever way we mean utility and value. And there's an entire set of PhDs in what we mean by utility and value. However, that connection of economically driven and value of material is something we need to bear in mind when we talk about digital preservation and we talk about these big pictures. Digital preservation isn't limited to state institutions. Lots of institutions do digital preservation and need to do digital preservation, and we need to understand that many hands will make this possible, that it will not be down to a small number of national archives and national libraries to do this job. And finally, one further assumption, a personal bias. 14th century monk from the UK named William of Ockham and his principle of parsimony. Okay? Those of you who have Googled me will know that I care a lot about this particular gentleman and his principle of parsimony. So, next, just very briefly to ground a few things, a short story. I'm going to talk now about my maternal grandfather. Now, my maternal grandfather, his name was Dennis Lionel Prosser, and he was born in 1892 in Elmore, which is a small village just south of the River Severn, 5 miles south of Gloucester. Now, that village is mentioned in the Domesday Book, and I'm just going to make sure I've got my facts correct, because I wrote them down so I don't get them wrong. It had 6 households and a value to its lord of £1.50. Okay? Now, a little bit later, it became part of the Guise baronetcy, and it's been in the broad possession of the Guise baronetcy now for some 800 years. Okay, so far so good. How does Lionel appear in the record? Well, Lionel first appears in the record in the registration of his birth. Now, the register entry lists his mother, Mary Prosser, and another woman who was present at the birth and who is in the informant for the registration of that birth. A little further research, very little in fact, results in finding Lionel in the 1901, 1911, and 1913 censuses and the 1939 register. And the 1939 register was taken at the outbreak of war for the purpose of issuing identity cards in the UK. And I can remember Lionel as a quiet, intelligent old man in his 80s and early 90s as I was growing up. And Lionel passed away aged 94 in 1986. So far so good, so normal family history, so, what's interesting here? Well, Lionel had a secret. Or rather, he had two things that were never discussed. The first thing that was never discussed was that he was illegitimate. Now, you can work this out from the sparse entry in his registration, because as I've indicated, the only two people mentioned on the birth registration are his mother and this other lady. His father isn't mentioned. Now, this illegitimacy was a source of enormous shame to Lionel for his entire life, and I only found out about it after he passed away. Now, how did that happen? Well, the discussion arose, as one often happens at the death of a relative. One sits and discusses past times with other relatives. And the discussion arose when we were looking back at some photographs of my parents' wedding. And my mother remarked, "Oh, of course, Dad smudged his signature on the registration of my marriage." I'm like, "What?" And she said, "Oh, yes," she said, "because we were married in Ely Church," which is a village also in Gloucestershire, "and his baptism's there, and he didn't want my marriage, to be related to his baptismal record, where it revealed he was illegitimate." Oh, okay, right. So quickly process that little bit of family information that comes as a bit of a shock, but okay, cool, no problem. And, life moves on and we carry on. Then sometime later, as happens, my mother passed away. And then we come to the other part of the secret. Because, 1892, who's going to know who his father was? Well, it turns out that lots of people knew who his father was. And not only that, lots of people who were my mother's contemporaries knew who his father was. Now, my mother was born in 1927. 30 plus years after the events that led to Lionel's birth. And yet, contemporaries of my mother knew, as a matter of common knowledge, in the village of Elmore, who my grandfather's father was. So, this means, I want to now think about what that means for privacy. So actually, of course, Lionel's illegitimacy was not, by definition, private. It is revealed in a public document, in the public domain, his registration. Any one of you can go to Gloucestershire Records Office and request a birth certificate for the purposes of looking at family history, as indeed I did. So it's public domain knowledge. And of course, Lionel's parentage wasn't private either, because it was common knowledge 40 to 50 years after his birth. Now, those things are both true, but another thing that is also true is that it was deeply sensitive. And that's the point that I want to get across here, that sensitivity and privacy are not necessarily the same thing. Now, moving on quickly, hopefully. How are we doing for time? We're taking far too long, so we'll rattle away here. I want to talk a little bit about privacy and identity there and now. So, the European Convention on Human Rights speaks to two rights in this general space. There's a qualified right to a private life, and there is a less qualified right to assert identity. Now, the right to a private life is quite heavily qualified. The fact that we register births is, in fact, of course, an infringement of the right to a private life. It is the state asserting that it will capture certain facts about you and make those facts available to the public domain. Okay? And there are a number of other things that the state legitimately does that impinges on your right to a private life. And we're all most of us, most of the time, are comfortable with those things. I mean, the whole issue around surveillance, of course, is an area of tension there, but we're not going there today. What is much less qualified is one's right to assert one's identity. Now, it turns out that the European Union right to be forgotten, as is spoken about a lot at the moment, turns out to be mostly about identity. The right to be forgotten doesn't prevent archives keeping things, but it does prevent us revealing things whilst the person is living. Okay? And that is to permit individuals to assert things about themselves and to assert their identity. So Lionel's secret wasn't private, but it was a matter of his identity. In smudging that signature on my mother's marriage certificate, he was implicitly asserting his right to be identified as legitimate. Okay? So let's have a little think about villages. How big is the village? Okay. Well, the village of Elmore now has a population of approximately 220 persons. In 1894, it was approximately 430 persons. Okay, so far so good. Let's have a look at online. The average-sized Facebook friend group, that is, the friends that you as an individual have on Facebook, averages at 340 friends. The median, that's the most common value, if I understand my limited statistics, is 200. Okay. Now, those two numbers are arm-waving. You know, this is narrative, right, guys? Are arm-wavily approximately the same size as the village of Elmore, okay, in the various two time frames. And remember, 430 persons, or thereabouts, or a collection of them, knew of my grandfather's parentage. A private matter that was not private within that group. My contention is the village is now online, but privacy and identity probably hasn't really changed. We're still new to this idea of living online. The idea of living online hasn't been around for very long in practice. We need to learn to mitigate discoverability and manage those very plastic and very permeable membranes that are around personal information and privacy. And we don't yet know how to do that. And that's not a matter of the mechanisms not being there, it's a matter of the social structures not being there, and us as human beings not knowing how to work those structures efficiently. So, click to the next thing. Is that going to work? Yes. The world has changed. We all know that. The world has gone digital. Everything is different. Okay? Emails, Facebook, blogs, YouTube, case management system, tweets, government service portals. Yes. Oh, I do love a good service portal. Societies and their heritage are now digital, as we've heard earlier. Okay. But actually, everything's still the same. Governments make and document policy. Citizens interact with each other and the states, and the state. People and societies wish to remember. Oh no, that was the wrong button. I didn't want to. Good, it didn't work. I'm pleased about that. So, why do we keep things? Why do we want to keep documentary heritage? Well, David's spoken to this. Kylie's spoken to this already. The writing of histories, multiple and contested, genealogy, accountability, transparency, restitution of wrongs, holding power to account, the fundamental evidence base for the rule of law. Have you ever read the book by John Bingham? It's called The Rule of Law. It's a little short book. And a good friend of mine once advised me to read it. He said, it's all about archives, he said. And I went, oh yeah, okay. It wasn't very expensive, ordered it on Amazon as you do, and started. First thing you do, of course, when you get a new book is you look in the back, look for the index. Where's archives? Where's archives? It's not in there. That's interesting. Okay, so you start reading it, and it's a brilliant book. I completely recommend it to you. Bingham was one of the first members of the UK Supreme Court when it was founded. And it's beautifully written book, and explains the rule of law perfectly. And I'm reading through it, and I'm thinking, I haven't come to the archives yet. And I get to the end, having enjoyed this beautifully written narrative, and then I realise The entire book is, in fact, about the archives without mentioning the archive at all. Because every aspect of the book is talking about evidence. Every aspect of the book is talking about how you can demonstrate in a court that something occurred. And the only place you can go for that is, in fact, of course, the archive and our ability to remember. So, remembering is about defining our societies. Now, more generally, there's a concept that has been developed just recently by a gentleman called Luciano Floridi in the UK, and he talks about archives being a source of semantic capital. Now, he's a philosopher, and I don't understand this stuff, but I think what he's saying is it's a source of material that enables us to interpret our world, now and in the future. So, let's have a look at the shape of these collections, what we currently keep. Institutions largely record the actions of elites. Sorry, but it's true. They're driven by selection and perceptions of value, whatever value means to that institution, whatever value has meant in the past. There are some notable exceptions in the UK where we're not looking at elites. So the National Records of Scotland is a very good example of that. We statutorily collect the record of every single court case that takes place in Scotland, including the documentary evidence that is presented in that case. Now, in practice, we weed some of the lower level matters out because we just don't have enough shelf space right now. However, in the future, I expect that we will be taking every single court case from the speeding fines right to the multiple murderers. So that isn't about elites. That's about the interaction of citizens with the state in a very particular way. We take census records at the National Records of Scotland, and there's some amazing examples of community archives in the Scottish Islands where the islanders are capturing local information and literally keeping it in the disused schools rather than so that they can keep it within their own communities. A particular instance that I would like to mention, when I joined the National Archives, I was introduced to a very senior archivist who was responsible for selection. And I had the temerity to suggest that in the digital world we might want to keep a bit more stuff than we did in the paper world. And in a fit of pique, the lady sort of spat back at me, "So you're one of these people that wants to keep his grandfather's bus tickets?" I'm like, oh. I was quite taken aback at this. Unfortunately, I didn't have the foresight in that meeting to say, no, I don't want Grandad's bus tickets, but do you know what? I'd really rather like a collection of the entire year's worth of data from the London Transport Oyster card system. Because do you know what? That'd be quite useful, wouldn't it? So, shape of things to come. The digital has democratized things. Okay, what will my daughter's documentary heritage be? Okay, when I'm pushing up daisies, as they say. Well, I don't know, but I would like to add to it, if I may. Right, ladies and gentlemen, please smile. Thank you. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. That's now a piece of my little piece of my documentary heritage. There we go. So my tweets are, I'm a bit prolific on Twitter. 44,000 tweets, apparently, it said, and when I last looked, which is rather scary. Rather fewer Facebook posts. But that will be the documentary heritage that my daughter inherits, I guess. In Scotland, we will have much more case material. We've recently, in the last decade, we had a seminal report, the Shaw Report, that looked at how people who the state had cared for in the past had been wronged, and observed that one of the real problems that they had was that no records were kept. And that has resulted in a new act, the Public Records Scotland Act from 2011, and that is enabling us to capture much more information about the activities of the state. Many wrongs have been done. We need more records so that restitution is possible. But of course, all of this means we have much more personal and sensitive data. But that's a good thing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by sensitivity. So what do we mean by sensitivity? Well, this is quite tricky. It turns out to be much, much trickier than you expect when you first start thinking about this problem. So, first of all, I want to talk about how we might define sensitivity. Okay? Well, the UK Freedom of Information Act has a go at this, okay? Because it has this concept of exemptions, that exempt material from release, because that material is sensitive. So let's look at what those exemptions might include. Well, they're all numbered with sections, as the way you get with laws. So there's a section 24 that talks about national security. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. There's a section 27 that talks about damage to international relations. Okay, again, I think we can all see that that makes some sense. There's stuff about personal information. Okay, and there's stuff about commercial information. Okay, this is all fine and dandy. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't quite work. Okay, it doesn't quite work because it turns out that sensitivity is considerably more nuanced than some sections in an Act of Parliament. So let's do a little thought experiment. I'd like you to think about a text that describes the capability of a piece of military hardware. Okay, not too hard to imagine. Imagine that is published by a journalist in Jane's Fighting, let's say Jane's Fighting Ships, okay? International Journal of Military Material, okay? And it's copied into a government system for reference. Now, when that comes up for review, is that sensitive? Well, clearly not, because it was written by a journalist. It is by definition speculative. Okay? How can they possibly know? In inverted commas. However, imagine exactly the same text, exactly the same description, where the authorship is a civil servant in the Ministry of Defence. Well, all of a sudden, it becomes sensitive, right? Because it now has the authority of the civil servant. So it turns out that sensitivity is dependent upon who said the thing. Okay? So now let's think of another little example. Imagine a commercial agreement which has significant market consequences for the companies concerned that a government is entering into. Okay? Right. Prior to the formal announcement, this is clearly incredibly sensitive. Okay? However, as soon as it's announced, it's in the public domain, by definition. So, and likewise in the public sector, creation of a trade policy, whilst it's being negotiated, is incredibly sensitive. The moment that trade policy is announced, clearly has no more sensitivity associated with it. So it turns out that when something is said, the date on which it was said turns out to be rather important from the purposes of determining if something is sensitive or not. Now, another text, okay? This time relating to an arms deal with another country. Now, if that country is a modern liberal democracy where the relationship between two countries is well known and there's existing friendly relationships, so for example, the arrangement is going to lead to I can't remember the designation of the fighter jets. The American fighter jets flying off the new UK carrier fleet. I mean, there's no sensitivity in that. It's an arms deal, a relationship between two countries in NATO, not a problem. Now imagine instead that is an exchange of military hardware with a country that is ruled by a dynastic and oppressive regime, in which the relationship is much more of convenience than natural alignment. Now, the nature of that deal is suddenly highly sensitive. Okay? So, other parties, therefore, become interesting. So it ends up being about about whom something was said. So now another text, 17th century England now. describes religious or ethnic minorities in that period. Imagine the words and the language that that text might use from the 17th century. Now consider an identical text, but the authorship is modern today. Now, in the context of a historical document, the language, even though we would regard it as reprehensible, wouldn't be considered sensitive because it is a reflection of what was said then, and that is the past. However, that same text written today would, of course, be incredibly sensitive. It would be inflammatory. So it turns out that the context in which something is said matters. Now, a couple more things. Jurisdictions. So I want you to think about the language in Acts. In Britain, we have this strange arrangement called devolution, and I live that because I live in Scotland now. And we have two different Freedom of Information Acts. Okay? We have the FOIA Act, FOIA Act of 2000, enacted by the Westminster Parliament, and we have the Freedom of Information (Scotland) Act from 2002 that was enacted by the Scottish Parliament. Okay. Now, in describing things that can be withheld from the public, the word damage is used in both of these acts. Okay. In the Act in Westminster, it says words to the effect of, "You may withhold material if damage will be caused." This is fine. Now, I don't know the motivation, but I suspect there was a motivation to say, no, in Scotland we're going to be more transparent. Okay? And in that context, the FOIA Act says you may withhold things if there is substantial damage caused. Now, in that single word is everything, because it raises the bar hugely as to what can be withheld and drives a much more open context. And that's just one word in one act between two very closely related jurisdictions. Okay, so so jurisdictions matter. So let's talk about wider jurisdictions then. In Europe, the locus is the Human Rights Act and refers to natural persons in terms of personal information. Now, natural persons are defined as the living in the human rights frameworks. In the US, the locus is the US Constitution and amendments. And that, of course, grants rights to citizens. Now, that's quite different from granting rights to humans. Okay? That distinction is usually glossed over, it has to be said. But if you're ever a visitor to the United States and you don't happen to be a US citizen, I advise you to think quite carefully about the distinction between citizens' rights and human rights. Okay? Because it does make a big difference to you. And of course, if we think about other jurisdictions, other cultures, there were many different perspectives, in particular in respect of persons, in respect of privacy, in respect of what identity means, and of course, in respect of time. So all of a sudden, we now have culture as being a very significant matter in sensitivity. So here's a definition of sensitivity. Sensitivity is about who said what, to whom, when, in what context, in which jurisdiction, and relating to which culture. God, that's complicated. Human judgment is needed when judging sensitivity. Okay. So we have a dilemma. We have the right to be forgotten, and we have a duty to remember. We have an intertwingled world. That's a word created by Ted Nelson in 1974. Google it. It's an amazing word. Okay, it's my favorite word, intertwingled. Okay, all right, much better even than serendipitous. It's the word. Okay. Unexpected. What it means for us, of course, is that if we have too much transparency, unexpected links can lead to unexpected revelations. So we end up in a situation, if we're not careful, that this keeping of digital documentary heritage could be perceived as a threat by people whose material we are keeping. This is back to trust. David mentioned trust in institutions. Trust is being eroded for right or wrong. We need to understand how that trust works. And we need to make sure that whatever happens, the keeping of that documentary heritage is not perceived as a threat by the population at large. Now we go back to the economics of preservation. In the UK, we can keep material withheld within the Freedom of Information Act regime for up to 120 years. Okay. So why would governments, why would states choose to pay to keep stuff which we can't use? All right? We're going to keep all this prisoner. We're going to keep terabytes, petabytes, exabytes of this stuff, but it's sensitive, so we can't use it. And we've got to hang on to it for decades and decades and decades before it becomes of economic value. And remember, digital preservation is an economically driven matter. Selection is driven by utility, by value. So we've got things pressing on us here in all sorts of directions that are really difficult to resolve. And the way we resolve them, of course, is by reviewing the material. Sensitivity review. We need to understand the sensitivity of the material in fine grain as it arrives. Now, we do this all the time on paper. Our archival institutions, memory institutions do this all the time. But the volume is low and the ergonomics of paper are very good. We trust in manual reviewers. The example in the UK is the lovely group of people from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office who are ex-ambassadors who sit in a strange place near Milton Keynes called Hanslope Park, and they review Foreign Office material for release into the public records. And they're very good at it. And they're very trusted. And funnily enough, despite the fact that you might think the opposite, they want their legacy to be out there. They've served the public. They are public servants. They want their legacy of all their diplomatic efforts to be visible. So they have a strong pressure to release the material, despite being perceived as being part of the executive and having the contrary pressures. So this is fine. Paper works. It has worked for decades. It will continue to work. However, digital is not fine in this space. It is not tractable. The volume is enormously higher. The ergonomics of review are dreadful. Have you ever tried reading page after page after page of text in fine grain on a computer screen? Okay? It ain't fun. Okay? And I know there's a question here about digital natives and whether it's us ancient persons, such as myself, who find this challenging. I don't believe it is. I believe that digital natives are used to absorbing small facts on small screens rapidly. That's what phones do for us, the way those user interfaces work. But that's an entirely different prospect to having page upon page upon page of detailed text in which you're trying to detect the presence of a complex sensitivity. It's really difficult. And of course, if they make a cock-up, if they miss something, the mistakes are instantly exposed because that material suddenly becomes indexed, linked on Google. A single search can suddenly reveal material. Whereas in a classical paper world, you have to accidentally find a piece of paper in a folder which is not even indexed on the subject of sensitive subject surrounding it. So there's a problem here. We get many sensitivities once. The risk isn't binary. Also, the context of access matters. So I want to just quickly talk briefly about the concept of closure. So traditionally, in archival world, we talk about closed and open material. Either everyone can see it or nobody can see it, basically. I mean, that's a simplistic model, but it works for most situations at the moment in most places. Now, I know that in Australia you have you are developing new models in this space because of your heritage, and that's I think in that respect the rest of the world needs to look to Australia to get inspiration for the way that you're doing that, and I think that's really positive. However, the digital world does offer some other ways forward. So our organisation, National Records of Scotland, is also a statistical organisation as well as being an archival organisation. And one of the things we do is we take the decennial census. Now, the decennial census, of course, contains enormous quantities of personal information. And it is by statute restricted from release in full detail for 100 years, as it should be. Okay, so how come within a year or two of the census being taken, we publish detailed statistics down to quite small areas of geographic region? Well, the answer is a mechanism of approximation, obfuscation, and pseudonymization. They're good words, aren't they? I like those words. Pseudonymization is one of the nice words. Not as good as intertwingled or as serendipitous, but it's still quite a nice word. These mechanisms create what I call a digital veil of ignorance. That you can see facts about a small collection, but from those facts you can't deduce anything about individuals within that small collection. And there's some fiendishly horrible mathematics that the statisticians use to actually, my words not theirs, fake the data such that it is statistically still accurate, but prevents identification of information about individuals, even though the set of people which it might be talking about, say a set of households, is a small number. It's very clever stuff, but it's possible to do. Now, I think we need to look at both ends of our system. Okay. There's an input end and an output end to our digital heritage, yeah? And we need to start thinking about how we might empower reviewers on the supply side to gather more nuanced risk information, and how we might develop gradated access models on the output side to enable that finer-grained risk information and, to be exploited, so that we can expose material in different ways to research. Now, so if we're going to do this, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to understand sensitivity. I've already indicated how difficult it is to pin down the concept of sensitivity. We think we understand it. We instinctively. There used to be an advert in the UK for Croft Original Sherry. I don't know if it made it into this country, but at Christmas time, there would be somebody drinking sherry. Oh, that's awfully good sherry, sir. And the tagline was, "One instinctively knows when something is right." Okay, that was the marketing tag. Well, one instinctively knows when something is sensitive, right? We think. Okay. Of course, we don't, and that's the point. If we're going to make this process mechanical, if we're going to empower people to be efficient at it, we need a calculus of a framework of sensitivity. We need to understand how to articulate sensitivity in all these myriad aspects and that I mentioned earlier. How will we do that? Well, we might draw on the philosophy of ethics. So we probably want to talk to Professor Floridi in Oxford. We might want to draw on some ethnography. I should have pressed this button. I've got all excited and haven't pressed this button. So we're going to... come on. No, it's not going to work. There we go. I've talked about that. Have I talked about the next bit? Yeah, oh well. Tish, technology, who cares? Right, we'll leave that bit up there and we'll keep talking. So we probably want to draw on social and political science as well, because this is political. in the small p sense. I don't mean left and right, but this is about politics. This is about people. This is about a negotiation with the population about what we mean by sensitive, how we release information, what people are comfortable with or not comfortable with. We need to understand risk. We need to be much more quantitative about risk. We need to actually be able to say there is a probability of X that that in going through this process we will make a mistake and therefore this type of material might get released. And we need to understand what that means in terms of damage. So we need to get much more meticulous about our risk management models in this space. And we need to look upstream. We need to understand what is coming towards the memory institution and understand that supply chain and understand what's happening. Now, so far I've talked about how difficult this digital sensitivity review thing might be. And we need some research in algorithms here. We need to understand what features we need to capture. We need to understand what machine learning means in this context. And we need to understand ergonomics. Remember what I said about how it's difficult to review on screen? Well, let's think about this thing. Imagine we have a tool that can predict the sensitivity of things and put things in sensitivity rank order. Okay? Imagine that. And we're gonna help a reviewer to make a decision, because this is a human decision. We don't want the computer to make the decision on its own. Okay? So what order should we present the material to the reviewer? Okay? We've got this magic system that puts things in rank order. Well, if we put them the most sensitive first, we're wasting the reviewer's time, right? Because the computer's probably going to get that right most of the time. So we waste their time until they get a bit further into the list. They get very bored. They make mistakes. Okay, let's flip it around. We'll present the least sensitive first. Well, that has exactly the same problem, because they get very bored. Oh, God, I've seen the 25 of these already, and they're all not sensitive. So the brain shuts down. Okay, the way it works best for the computer, it turns out, is to present things that are most uncertain first. The ones that the computer isn't sure about. Because then the computer can learn from the response of the human and get better at making the discrimination. The problem is with that is human beings don't understand why they've seen this one, and this one arriving in that order, because that order of most uncertain first is based on what the computer thinks is uncertain, and the human being's looking at it and says, this sequence doesn't make any sense to me at all. Now that becomes a problem. So ergonomics are a big deal here. When do we stop? How do we estimate this risk? If we're doing this process, because if we review everything as a human being, when we haven't saved any energy, if we trust, at what point do we trust the computer? When have we reduced the risk to the point that we can cope with the risk? Well, that's difficult as well. We need research about these things. And we also need what are called test collections, because we need to be able to prove that the thing works. We need to be able to have some experiment that says, we applied this new algorithm to this set of data, and look, it did better than the last algorithm. Okay? And of course, test collections for sensitivity are quite difficult to construct, because by definition, the collection is sensitive. Okay, we also need to understand, on the other side, on the demand side, we need to understand what the researcher's question might be. We need to understand what a good enough answer looks like. We need to understand this idea of virtual reading rooms. We need to understand this concept better of what I call gradated access. Can we have brokered queries? Can I ask a question of the archive and somebody else goes and looks, or a system goes and looks for me and tells me what I'm allowed to see, which isn't everything? And how does that work for a historian? I can imagine historian colleagues and friends of mine tearing their hair at the concept of that, because that's the state withholding information from them as historians. And yes, I know I'm running out of time, Sean. So what is it safe to reveal in which context? How does this process, how could this approximation, obfuscation, and pseudonymization work with digital heritage material in the way that it works with statistical material? And how can we get this quantitative and active risk management working? These are enormous research questions. This is a multidisciplinary problem. This is not a problem to be solved by archivists on their own, or librarians on their own, or computer scientists on their own. We actually need to bring people together. And it turns out that that is incredibly difficult. Okay? Myself and some colleagues tried to do this a few years ago in Scotland. We tried to put together a multidisciplinary team and convince some research funding bodies that this was a good idea. The problem was, if it was archival, we went to one funding body. If it was library, went to another funding body. If it was computing science, we went to another funding body. But it was all of those things. So which funding body did we go to? Well, we tried all of them. And they all went, no, it's not us, it's them. And we said, no, it's all of you. No, we can't do that. That doesn't compute. That doesn't make sense to us. Now, is this a matter for archival research? Well, yes, it is, but we want some ethnographers. But that's humanities. Yeah, we know. We didn't get anywhere. We couldn't convince people that a multidisciplinary problem of this fiendish nature could be funded. So what's the future going to look like? Hopefully I've got enough moments left to talk about this. Let's imagine a comprehensive memory institution now that has collected all this digital heritage. It collects the policy of what was intended. It collects case information. It collects society's digital footprints in the sand. I like that image. And we have machine-assisted processing. So we have machine-assisted appraisal that has this concept that uses a wide concept of value, that doesn't look at value purely from a monetary perspective, looks at the rule of law value, looks at all these other values. We have machine-assisted sensitivity review. The rights are clearly balanced and respected. And we have this multifaceted, non-disclosive access that means that the material can be used and has utility. And that is how we solve this dilemma of the fact that we have to spend huge amounts of money keeping this stuff for a long time in which nobody can see it, because we can exploit the value of the collection without revealing the fine-grained detail that is explicitly sensitive. There we go. Have I hit my timings? 2 or 3 minutes. Well, it's better than last time. I was 5 minutes last time. So I'm cool with that. Thank you very much.